You're listening to The Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Haristadoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to The Greeks Gridiron. I'm Ethan Haristadoulou, and today, taking a look at none other than the NFC East, where we have some pretty good defenses to look at this time around. We're ranking them from worst to first with a lot to discuss, a lot to dive into. I invite you all to do the same in the comments section down below. Let me know your rankings, thoughts on mine. What am I getting right? What am I getting wrong? Always love discussing with you all. But starting first at the bottom, as we always do, working our way up to the top. There's a pretty clear-cut number 4 in this division, in my opinion, here, and I hate to put it that way, but I think that is the kind of reality that the Washington Commanders are currently sitting in right now. To put it simply, last season was basically as big of a collapse defensively as you could possibly have. Now, I know there's been a lot going on in Washington over the last few years, so it's kind of understandably so, but there is a lot to work on. And some of the big numbers that really stood out to me as far as most points per game allowed, most yards per game allowed, second most yards per play allowed, most passing touchdowns allowed. They were bottom 5 on third downs. They had the worst pressure rate in the NFL, despite the amount of talent prior and then after the fact getting even worse of trading away some top-tier talent on the defensive line. The good news is, though, a lot of work has been done in Washington, and I like the direction they're trying to head in. It is very clear that this is a new era, and it feels like it started this offseason, but it really gets to kick off, and we get to see the fruits of the labor going into this 2024 season. And again, a lot of additions, looking forward to seeing how they play out. Unfortunately, the likelihood that every single one of those additions are a hit is not really there, but I would have to argue that whatever was added to this defense this offseason has got to give a better end result than what we got from Washington last year. But I will say that Dan Quinn and his defensive coordinator, Joe Witt Jr., have quite a bit of work to do. But thankfully, defensive-minded head coach Joe Witt Jr., someone that I didn't really know a ton about until I did some reading up on him, seems like he's got some respect around the league as an up-and-coming person. So I'm excited to see what they can do. Now, the player changes, taking a look at how the personnel is going to look a little bit differently. Obviously, we saw some big trades of defensive linemen during the middle of the season last year, but now we're talking even more guys stepping on their way out as we see a bunch of new guys come on in. The big ones, though, cornerback Kendall Fuller, safety Cameron Curl, linebacker Cody Barton, all allowed to walk, but the team spent a ton of money and a ton of draft capital on the defense to try to mitigate those losses and also improve in areas of need. We'll start first at defensive end. Dorrance Armstrong, a guy that's had 16 sacks and 17 tackles for loss the past couple of seasons here, coming over from, I believe, Dallas. So that should be a nice addition on the defensive front here as they look to find out who's going to be their premier pass rushers on the ends of their defensive line going forward after trading away Sweat and Chase Young last year. We also have linebacker Frankie Louvu and linebacker Bobby Wagner coming in as the 1-2 punch at those linebacker positions here. And honestly, I like this because you get the veteran championship winning guy, but also a guy in Frankie Louvu who, in my opinion, the last couple of seasons has really ascended as one of the better linebackers in the NFL with 236 tackles, 29 tackles for loss, 12.5 sacks over the last couple of seasons here. He's been a very effective guy over there in Carolina. And then, of course, Bobby Wagner. He needs no introduction. We all know who he is. At one of the best linebackers that we've had of the past decade in the NFL here, even if he's not quite where he was a few years back, still that leadership of a former champion like himself, I think will be a welcome addition to the locker room. You also got safety Jeremy Chin, who, yes, a couple of down years, especially with the injuries that he's been dealing with, but I will say that when you look at his first 2 seasons, defensive rookie of the year, and coming out of that second season, going into his third, a lot of people looked to him as a guy that was an emerging safety in the NFL and one of those people that was vying to be considered amongst the best in the NFL. So one that I'm excited to see in a change of scenery, how he fares under the tutelage of Dan Quinn. You also have some other guys like Clelin Ferrell, Dante Fowler Jr., Michael Davis, all guys that are veterans. Clelin Ferrell, kind of a guy, former first-round pick that is trying to figure out where he can fit into a defense and reach the first-round potential that he has pegged on him from when he was taken in the draft. And then some fun draftees, 2 second-round picks, Jerzon Newton, probably, or arguably, I guess you could say, the best interior defensive lineman in the draft. Another big name that Washington seems to be known for going after those big guys in the first couple of rounds of the draft, so not surprising to see him there. You also got a nickelback in Mike I believe it's Senristil. I don't really know how to pronounce that, to be honest, but coming from that stout Michigan defense, you've got a lot to look forward to And I think that, again, whatever you get this season should be an improvement upon last. The problem is that Washington was so far and away the worst defense in the NFL last year, and I'm sorry to just kind of lay it out thick like that, but that is the truth. When you look at basically every single number, it feels like Washington's either in last or in the bottom 5 somewhere. They've got a lot of catching up to do. You also have other guys that were maybe limited in play time last year that are coming back into the fold. A guy like Fidarian Mathis that a lot of people have been high on. He only played in 10 games last season. You had safety Derek Forrest, who only played in 5 games, and he's slated to start opposite of, I believe, Jeremy Chin. If I check the depth chart here, yes, that is correct. And then we also have a guy like linebacker Jamin Davis, who only played in 13 games, hasn't quite hit like that full potential that I think the first round selection put onto Jamin Davis. So I do think that I'll be interested in seeing how Joe Witt and Dan Quinn help bring his abilities to life in this defense here, because he's somebody that with his pedigree coming out of the draft, I think a lot of people were hoping to, see him emerge as like a top 5 linebacker in the NFL. So it's up to Dan Quinn and company to make that happen. I'm expecting improvement from this defense this year. There is a lot of intrigue with the way the Washington Commanders are being built right now, and I think that the future is brighter than it has been in quite some time in Washington, and I like overall what we're seeing with the direction they're heading. But again, the gap was so big last year between the Commanders and what feels like everybody else. It's going to take some time to build up and reach your fullest potential. So I'm having them at 4 right now. I'm expecting progress, but they've got some work to do. Now, moving into the number 3 spot, this is where things really start to get interesting, because we've had some really cool additions to all of these defenses going through this past offseason, but I think the Giants definitely have some of the most exciting things to look forward to coming out of this offseason, with Shane Bowen taking over as defensive coordinator following some drama surrounding defensive coordinator last season. I think it'll be interesting to see how this defense takes shape going forward. There is a good argument to be made that this group, finishing as the second best defense potentially in the NFC East last season, that maybe you could argue, do they belong above the Eagles? Possibly, but I do think that on paper, talent-wise, I kind of like Philadelphia a little bit more, hence why I settled with the Giants at number 3 here. But I mean, there was some notable numbers when you go back and you look at what this defense did. Despite all the struggles on offense and the positions that they were put in at times here, they had fewer points per game allowed than Philadelphia. They were a better passing defense than Philadelphia last season. They even got penalized less, so they were a far more disciplined defense on top of that. Now, if they can just improve on stopping the run and get, just a little more tougher up front, I do think with what they did this past offseason, you have yourself a pretty good defense over there in New York. That's going to keep games close, but it really is going to come down to, can this offense improve on the other side of the football, and just how many bad places are they going to put the defense in that maybe puts them into some compromising situations. I really hope that doesn't end up being the case, and I hope somehow, some way, we do see improvement from the offensive side of the ball, because it's very clear if offenses are putting defenses in bad places, they can only bend so much before they start to break, and you don't want to see things like that. I really wanted to put this defense at 2, but I do think that there is just a slight bit of difference when it comes to the talent level that you have on both of these. But that's not to say that the Giants aren't an exciting group overall. Bringing in Brian Burns got to be one of the craziest things we saw from this offseason here. Pairing him alongside Kayvon Thibodeau, that's going to be an unbelievable group. Brian Burns is a guy that has 46 sacks and 59 tackles for loss, and I can't believe that somehow, some way, Carolina went no to 2 first-round picks just the year prior, and then took, what was it, like a 3rd-round pick or a 2nd-round pick for him this time around. You want to talk about a whiff on Carolina's end and an absolute steal for the New York Giants defensively. You bring in Jordan Phillips at the defensive tackle spot. He's going to take up that big hole that Leonard Williams left open when he departed from the team at the trade deadline last year. And some nice veteran additions here. A guy like Matthew Adams at the outside linebacker spot should be some good depth to an already pretty strong linebacker room. You got Jalen Mills as well, who's been playing more of a safety type of role, but a guy who's been in a handful of secondaries over the duration of his career. He knows a lot, and this is a pretty young secondary to be working with, so he doesn't have to step in and be a starter, but he can definitely show some of the young guns a thing or two, and I think he's someone worth listening to. And he also drafted a pair of defensive backs this past offseason that are probably going to be slated to start as well. At least they look like that so far per Our Lads. Obviously, that can change, but you have Tyler Nubin, who some people looked at as the best safety coming out of the draft. And you also had Drew Phillips, who's slated for the nickelback role as well. Newbin having 13 interceptions during his collegiate career. There's a lot to be excited about, I would say. We also have a guy like Azeez Ojulari, who only played in 11 games last season. Now, pressure's off of him with Brian Burns coming in. He doesn't necessarily have to come back and steamroll, but it'll be nice to have a guy like Brian Burns, Kayvon Thibodeau leading the way, and hopefully Azeez Ojulari can start to progress without the pressure of being out there every single time that they're in a passing situation, that maybe we see some growth from his game and maybe he could be a bigger contributor like they were hoping he would be. Again, I'm really looking forward to seeing how this defense looks. And when I look at them all together, like, there's not really a lot to be disappointed about. I mean, the defensive line, Brian Burns, Dexter Lawrence, Jordan Phillips, and Kayvon Thibodeau, that's definitely an impressive group of guys there. And I'm a big fan of the linebacker room. I mean, Micah McFadden and Bobby Okereke, as somebody who grew up rooting for the Colts, big fan of Okereke, and I love what he works with. And Matthew Adams, a guy that came from Cleveland, but before that was in Indianapolis. I like what we have there. And also Isaiah Simmons. I think that these are some really, not necessarily like name, or what is the word here? Household names, thank you, is what I'm looking for here. Not necessarily household names, but good quality guys at the linebacker position here. And I think Okereke is extremely underrated. Very young secondary is a bit of a concern. We'll see how that works out. But overall, I do like what the Giants are working with right now. And this is a defense that I think could shock some people and honestly maybe even prove me wrong. Because like I said, I spent a lot of time considering them potentially at number 2, but I settled with them at 3 because I do think the talent at number 2, and we'll start to segue into that one there, with the Philadelphia Eagles does outweigh what the Giants have. Now, a lot of this is on paper conversation here, and I think that we can't ignore just how bad this defense was towards the tail end of last season here. A defense that just kind of completely collapsed, and it felt like almost the entire team did, but we saw a massive drop-off from what was a pretty stiff run defense early on to becoming one of the worst, averaging close to like sometimes 130, 40, 50 yards a game during certain stretches of the later portions of the season. Injuries didn't help the matter as well. There was obviously the conversation of maybe the locker room being lost and Nick Sirianni not really having a hold on the team like he did. There is a lot to kind of hope isn't necessarily true, or maybe was a little bit overblown, or maybe has at least been resolved depending on where you stand and what you believe in regards to all of that. But I do think Vic Fangio coming in, he's got a pretty good track record with some defenses. You look at like his 2011 49ers defense, his 2018 Bears defense that ultimately landed him a Broncos head coaching job. This is a guy who I think brings a lot of experience and someone who could take advantage of what I would consider one of the more talented defensive rosters in the NFL right now. Like, you're looking at some big name guys at almost every single position and people that are considered first day contributors, even if they are draftees. So the big question really is just, are the problems that emerged last season resolved? Because I look at the Eagles as the most volatile defense in this division and potentially even in the NFL right now. I think the ceiling is so high, but the floor could also be very, very low, because we saw, despite the amount of talent they have, what dysfunction can do to a team. So I am concerned. But like, when you look at the way things have been adjusted on this roster here, I'm beyond excited to see what the Eagles end up doing here. You trade Hassan Reddick, you let Nicholas Morrow and Kevin Byard leave. Those are like your big notable losses here. But then you look at what's coming in and where this defense could potentially go. Secondary seeing a lot of changes, and honestly some welcome changes in my opinion here. And the first one, another former Indianapolis Colt, a guy who got suspended for some crazy gambling stuff. He was ascending in Indianapolis and was arguably their cornerback number 2, and was honestly outside of Kenny Moore, was like vying for cornerback number 1 on the outside, because Moore is a nickelback. But Isaiah Rodgers is a guy that I genuinely hope people don't forget how good he was, because there was a point in time where he was really coming into his own in Indianapolis. You have CJ Gardner-Johnson coming in, the homecoming for him. I think his attitude fits Philadelphia perfectly. And then you look at some of the corners they drafted. You have in round 1, Quinion Mitchell, round 2, Cooper DeJean, two top-tier athletes at the position coming out of the draft. I think the MO was basically, we need to get better in the secondary, but also we need to get supremely athletic. And I think they did a really good job at doing that, especially because you look at guys like Darius Slay and James Bradbury, who'd been kind of leading the way the last couple of seasons there. Father Time does start to catch up eventually. I still have mad respect for Darius Slay. I'm not going to sit here and act like he's falling off. I still think he's one of the most savvy corners in the NFL. But again, Father Time does eventually catch up to you. You have Bryce Huff coming in, who's going to work in and kind of replace Hassan Reddick's production there, coming off a career best 10 sacks last season. You have Devin White coming in from Tampa Bay, who is one of the better off-ball linebackers in the NFL. 100 tackles, 23 sacks, 21 pass breakups, 40 tackles for loss. Like, this is a guy that can come in and he can get the job done. He's a supreme athlete at that. And then you have guys like Zach Bond, Oren Burks coming in. Philadelphia is very deep at basically every single position. And like, I didn't even mention the defensive line and what they have there with Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter. You still have Brandon Graham, who's around there. There's a lot to be excited about with this defense. And then guys coming back, Nakobe Dean, Avonte Maddox, Darius Slay, all missing time. The first two missing significant amount of time last year. The big question mark really just is, for me personally, are the problems from last season overblown? Are they true? Have they been resolved? Did they not even really need resolving? A lot of that has to do with just, or not a lot of that, but a lot of my feelings towards this defense has to do with, has all that been like sorted out and situated? I think Vic Fangio is a guy who can bring this defense to a very good place with how much talent is on here. But we saw what this defense looked like at the end of last season, and that genuinely concerns me. Because if something like that is broken and it has to do with Nick Sirianni, like what was being said, that genuinely concerns me. Because if you lose a locker room like that, it doesn't matter how much talent you have. So there is some concern for me and some reservations from a pure talent standpoint. I would literally put Philadelphia at 1. But with those concerns, I decided to settle on them at 2. So I hope Eagles fans, you guys understand where I'm coming from. I'm sorry you're not at number 1. I do think you are the most talented defense, but I'm concerned about some of the underlying issues there. I hope they're resolved. And whether they've been saying it has been or not doesn't really matter to me. The proof will be in the pudding when the season actually happens. And I need to see it to believe it. It doesn't matter what people are saying is kind of where I stand on those types of things. And then, of course, at number 1, we have the Dallas Cowboys. Who else but the boys themselves? Listen, this was the best defense in the division, statistically, if you want to keep it simple, by a wide margin here, compared to where everyone else kind of settled come season end here. Mike Zimmer is taking over the defense now as Dan Quinn has left to be the head coach of the Washington Commanders here. And he's had some highs with defenses when you look back at like his work with the Bengals. He's had some low with some of the failures in Minnesota while he was head coach over there. Some of his defenses did disappoint, didn't quite reach the level that I think Vikings fans were hoping for. But he's inheriting a very, very talented roster. And so I'm anticipating more of the highs than I am the lows in this situation here, because I do think Mike Zimmer is one of the better defensive minds when it comes to football. This is a takeaway hungry defense, like I said, littered with real talented guys. And there is a possibility that this unit takes a step forward off of what they did last year because of returning players and some of the additions that they made here. Now, you did lose a decent amount of guys on the defensive line. Probably your biggest concern going through the offseason is you're watching people depart. Dorrance Armstrong, Dante Fowler Jr., Jonathan Hankins. But despite that, you look at the group of guys and you're basically allowing these people to walk because you're ready to let some of the guys you've been drafting for the last few years step up and take over here. So yes, you see departures, but then you see a guy like Osa Odigizua and Maisie Smith stepping up. They're going to be slated to be starters per the Our Lads depth charts here, at least at this point in time. You still have Micah Parsons. You still have DeMarcus Lawrence. You still have some pretty intriguing guys behind them listed on the depth chart. Sam Williams, Marshawn Nealand. You also have Chauncey Golston as well. Like, there is a pretty strong group of guys on that defensive line that I'm very much looking forward to seeing now that we've watched some of these older guys depart from the team. They get to step up and really take over as a starter from day one of the season. Linebacker is going to see some big changes here. Obviously, Leighton Vander Esch opting to retire. We've also seen some people move around there. Eric Kendricks is coming in, joining from the Los Angeles Chargers. Very consistent guy who's been great for the majority of his career here. It looks like he's slated to start opposite of Damone Clark. Again, per Our Lads, if you're always wondering where I'm getting my depth chart info from. They get countless shout outs here, even though I don't get any sort of sponsorship with them. That's just who I go to and give in case somebody asks me where I'm getting this info from. You also have a 3rd round pick second linebacker, Liafu Amarist. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And you also have last year's third-round pick in DeMarvion Overshone, who did not play at all last season. Again, another guy that I'll be interested in seeing who missed all that time. And then the big one, of course, you cannot forget this. Despite, losing a big name in Stephon Gilmore in the secondary, here comes a guy, earned himself All-Pro honors a couple seasons ago, Trayvon Diggs, who literally played in just 2 games last season before he went down with an injury, an interception machine. Say what you want about his over-aggressiveness and how it may burn him at times. The guy's a playmaker, and he goes after the football, and that's I love that kind of style of play. It's very much like all or nothing, but when the all happens, it's very exciting and it's very fun to watch. And there's a reason that the Dallas Cowboys have led the league in turnovers the last, 3 or 4 years or something like that, is because of guys like Trayvon Diggs. Now, with him coming back, the emergence of Deron Bland last year and how he fares in the slot, Jordan Lewis, very capable guy opposite of him. You have an argument for one of the strongest groups on the defensive line in the division here, at least when it comes to starters. Maybe whether you want to argue depth and all that, I'll leave that up to you, but definitely one of the strongest groups there. And my real concern is basically just like your off-ball linebackers. I don't really think that this defense is going to miss too much of a step. And honestly, I think there's a potential they could be a little bit better than they were last year. So I'm very much looking forward to what Dallas has coming into this season, because the other concerns that I do have about some of the other teams, specifically like Washington and New York, what is the offense going to look like? How many bad spots are they going to put their defense in? That is obviously something to look at here with uncertainty around Daniel Jones and having a rookie quarterback in Washington. And again, my concerns, Philadelphia, arguably the most talented roster in the NFL on both sides of the football, but the problems last year made them look very much like a team that would maybe win 5 games in a full season if that's how they were playing the entire year and not just the back half of the season. How much of those issues have been resolved? Because with that, it could cause some cracks, some leaks in this defense here, but I'm very much excited to see how this division plays out. This is one of the more up in the air divisions, in my opinion, because depending on how some things fall and the way things move around as we go through the season, I think that there's a possibility Eagles steal the number 1 spot here. Maybe even the Giants surprise with the changes that they made and they take a step forward. There's a lot to be excited about here. But let me know in the comment section down below, what are you looking at as far as rankings for the NFC East? What are your thoughts on mine? Love to discuss with you all. But as always, if you made it to the end, I greatly appreciate it. I'll see you all next time. Have a good one.